On the dim night at Ruby's diner, Rosa Jenkins serves coffee with one hand and clutches her blue notebook with the other. Eviction notices, hospital bills, and her son Caleb's inhaler pressed between its pages. She's a mother fighting to keep a roof over their heads while the world looks away. But everything changes when a man in a black suit steps out of a car during her eviction, tearing up the order that would have taken everything from her. Who is he, and why has he chosen her debt? What begins as a rescue will soon reveal a dangerous truth about power, hidden fronts, and a mother who must decide how far she's willing to go to protect her child. Stay with us until the end to see how one moment can turn survival into courage, and how a quiet house can stand firm even when empires tremble. The morning the block filled with squad cars and cardboard, Rosa pushed Caleb's wheelchair over the cracked walkway like she'd rehearsed in her head, step by step, so nothing would shake loose. The blue notebook rode under her arm, fat with hospital receipts and letters from the bank that never picked up. "It's okay," she told Caleb, though he hadn't asked. He tucked his chin into the hood of his sweatshirt and held the inhaler the way kids hold a lucky stone. A deputy pointed her toward the curb. "Ma'am, please." Another man in a Navy windbreaker, North River's representative according to his badge, stood by the porch counting rooms on a clipboard like they were inventory in a storage unit. The movers had already tilted the couch onto a dolly and wrapped the corners in tape. One of them caught Rosa's eye and tried a small apology with his mouth. A local cameraman practiced a somber nod beside his van, waiting for the moment that made all the other minutes usable. "Just 2 more minutes," Rosa said, not sure to whom, pushing the chair until the front wheels kissed the gutter. The sheriff adjusted his hat, the windbreaker man checked his watch, and someone shouted for the truck to back in. Rosa hugged the notebook tighter. The way people do when holding on is the only thing that proves they lived here. "You got ID?" the sheriff asked the windbreaker, and the man produced a laminated card and a bundle of pages warm from a printer. "Writs in order," the windbreaker said, tapping a signature as if the ink itself had authority. "Notice served twice." 3 times, Rosa corrected, because accuracy felt like dignity. The deputy at the stoop lifted a box marked kitchen and handed it down like a newborn he'd rather not drop. Caleb coughed once, a dry sound swallowed by his sleeve. "Can we at least keep the medical stuff accessible?" Rosa asked, holding up the tote with the nebulizer kit. The deputy nodded. "We're not monsters." The cameraman's partner, the one with the boom mic that always seemed to hover a second too long, asked, "Ma'am, can we get your name?" Rosa looked at the lens, at the boredom behind it, and decided a name was the last thing she owned. "Just film what you came to film," she said, and turned the wheelchair so Caleb could see less of their house, becoming someone else's problem. On the porch, the windbreaker man folded the notice so the words possession and ordered faced out, like he wanted the camera to read them without help. The sedan arrived as if summoned by punctuation, hard stop, door open, a line drawn across the scene. A man in a black suit stepped onto the asphalt, buttoning his jacket with a practiced motion that asked no permission. He didn't look for the camera found him. "Who's that?" the mover with the couch whispered, because in every city, there's always a moment you realize the story is bigger than your job. The sheriff clocked the suit, read the posture, and moved off the porch. "Sir, this is an active—" "I know what it is," the man said, voice low enough not to perform for the boom mic. He carried a narrow, slate-colored folder that didn't bend when he held it like a promise. Rosa's first thought was that he looked like he could afford to forget people. Her second was that he didn't forget anything. He didn't glance at her, didn't scan the boxes, didn't pretend familiarity. He walked straight to the windbreaker man, who had stopped pretending this was routine. "You from North River?" the man in black asked. "I represent North River today," the windbreaker said, which wasn't exactly yes. "Good," the man in black replied. "Then you can accept service." "What service?" the sheriff asked, But the answer was already unfolding. The black suit man, someone said Kenji under their breath and swallowed the last name, opened the folder and produced papers with heavyweight edges, the kind that make regular paper feel like napkins. Assignment of lien, he said. Transfer of debt. He laid one page flat on the hood of the cruiser and pointed to a stamped box with a county seal and a series of digits that meant this was not a theatre piece. Effective as of 08 Wei Saura this morning. North River no longer holds this debt. I do. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The cameraman widened his stance, taste of a headline in his mouth. The windbreaker man took the pages like they might leave ink on him, eyes skimming the signatures and the notary emboss. This can't be right, he said, but he didn't sound like he believed himself. Call your office, the sheriff suggested, flattening the corner so the badge wouldn't crease the county seal. The windbreaker made the call, the kind you start with a sigh instead of a hello, then listened harder, then lowered the phone by inches, as if gravity had remembered it. They confirm, he said. The lien is satisfied. The sheriff straightened the brim of his hat and looked at the notice he'd intended to enforce. He read it once, then again, the way people reread when the future changes mid-sentence. He folded the paper along its original crease and tucked it back into the windbreaker's stack. Eviction's void, he said to the deputy on the porch, and the deputy stopped halfway down the steps with a box labeled pots, like maybe he'd forgotten what it weighed. The mover with the couch started to back up, hands high, as if furniture could apologize. You want me to film that? The cameraman asked the man in black, because sometimes the news needs permission to be real. The man in black finally turned his head, eyes not searching for light, just measuring distance. You can film whatever you're already filming, he said, but get the part where the bank got played. No smile, no savor, just the sentence, set gently on the table like a knife. The windbreaker man cleared his throat. Sir Kenji, this creates exposure for all parties. Exposure is what you have when the roof comes off, Kenji said, closing the folder with a sound that wasn't dramatic, just final. Rosa became aware that she hadn't taken a breath in a while and pressed the inhaler into Caleb's palm, just in case he needed the confidence of it. She wanted to ask a question big enough to match the moment, but big questions have a way of sounding like excuses, and there was nothing in this scene that excused anything. A neighbor from 3 doors down, the one who always watered her geraniums too much, whispered, "You're saved," as if the word were a blessing that could be shared. Rosa didn't look at her. She watched the sheriff's face thaw by degrees from official to human. She watched the deputy set the box back over the threshold as if returning a borrowed thing without the note. She watched the windbreaker man gather his papers into a stack that no longer arranged the day. The cameraman lowered the lens, disappointed that the natural ending had arrived too early and covered all the other shots. "Ma'am," he tried again, softer now. "Could we get your—" Rosa shook her head, just once, a small motion that meant she didn't owe her name to anyone today. When Kenji Yakuza turned toward her at last, it wasn't for effect. It was a glance that acknowledged she existed in the same space as the document, which was both more and less than acknowledgement. He didn't offer a hand. He didn't offer an explanation. He addressed the air between them, which in that moment included the sheriff, the windbreaker, the camera, the porch, the chair, the boy, the blue notebook, the entire neighborhood's understanding of how power moved. "The debt is mine," he said, as if narrating a transaction, not an intervention. "That's all you need today." He tipped his head to the sheriff, a courtesy, not deference, and stepped back the way he had come, the folder tucked again under his arm. Around them, motion restarted in cautious increments. A mover checking a strap that no longer held anything, the windbreaker man retreating to his car to call a manager who would pretend to have predicted this, the deputy carrying pots back inside and setting it on the counter as if it had always lived there. Rosa tightened her grip on the notebook and felt its weight change without changing. The street didn't cheer. There was no chorus, no relief wide enough to carry the day. People simply adjusted, the way they do when the rules get rewritten in a language only a few people speak. The sheriff nodded to Rosa, a simple gesture that admitted he'd come for one kind of work and found another. "We're done here," he said to his deputy, and the words sounded like a favor that no one could repay. The cameraman captured a final shot of the chair, the stoop, the closed folder, and the man in the black suit getting into a car without looking back. Caleb squeezed his mother's sleeve, a small code that meant, "Are we going home or are we still outside of it?" "We're right here," she answered, and for the first time all morning it was true. She scanned the edges of the moment, searching for the cost that wasn't printed anywhere. If gratitude were a form you could fill out, she would have done it. But what sat in her chest wasn't gratitude. It was a clean incision. In front of the cameras, Kenji Yakuza hadn't smiled. He had only informed the world that the debt was his now. And standing there with the blue notebook and her son's hand on her sleeve, Rosa felt not saved, but crossed by a power that had chosen her address. That afternoon, the black suit walked into Ruby's diner as if the morning had been an unrelated errand, and for a beat the clatter of forks remembered it was just lunch. He didn't sit in his usual booth. He chose the counter where Rosa could not pretend not to see him. "Coffee?" he said then. "No, thank you. We'll keep it short." He set a small matte folder on the formica and turned it so the tab faced her. "I'm offering you a job that isn't a job," he said, in the same tone he'd used on the curb when he moved the day out of harm's way. "You'll supervise community boxes for the Yakuza Fund, collection ledger distribution, families with immediate needs, groceries, utilities, urgent prescriptions. You will not solicit, you will not promise, you will only root." Rosa stood with the pot in her hand, as if it were a prop she needed to exit the scene, then set it down carefully and looked for the catch. "I'm a waitress," she said. "I don't have—" "You have a spine and a reputation for being fair," Kenji Yakuza replied. "That's the qualification." He slid over a card with a number that wasn't a name and tapped the folder. "Receipts must be complete. Names must exist. Nothing floats." He paused, measuring her hesitation without crowding it. "You take the folder home tonight, or you leave it with me and I find another set of hands. That's the only time limit." Rosa opened the folder because survival teaches you to open things before deciding if you can afford them. Inside, there were half a dozen forms printed in clear type. A one-page intake that asked for household number, last bill amounts, and what emergency brought them to the box. A disbursement receipt with 2 signature lines, hers and the beneficiary's. A reconciliation sheet listing each location day by day with cash in, cash out, and inventory of vouchers remaining. A thin invoice template for utility companies sat underneath, with a note in the margin, preferred, paid directly to provider. She could not ignore the practical, not when Caleb's current prescription ran out in 6 days. "This is clean," she said, hoping the word could carry 2 meanings and not raise suspicion. Kenji almost smiled, but didn't, his restraint more honest than charm. "Clean on paper," he said. "We'll keep it that way. People like to gossip about the word on the logo. They'll gossip less if the fridge is full and the lights stay on." He took out a pen she recognized because it was the kind rich men never lose, and wrote a figure on the inside cover. Her stipend, enough to sit the rent down and make it listen. "You're not required to be grateful," he added. Just competent." The first test wasn't theory, it was a delivery run. Kenji made a call, and a white van pulled into the alley behind Ruby's. A woman stepped out, late 30s, steady gaze, black blazer over a plain blouse, no jewelry except a narrow band on her right hand. "This is Aiko," Kenji said. She'll handle logistics. Aiko introduced herself to Rosa like a colleague, not a subordinate, and offered a short, efficient handshake that included a second of eye contact and the unspoken message: "I will not waste your time if you don't waste mine." They unloaded flat-pack donation boxes the color of new pool tiles, rolled bundles of tamper seals, rolls of printed stickers with a helpline number, and a cash tin that Aiko counted into Rosa's palm twice. 200 petty for change, 500 in grocery vouchers by 50s and 20s, 200 in utility vouchers. Ledger matches. You're responsible from this moment. The first installation happened at Alvarez Market, 4 blocks away, in the aisle that always smelled like plantains and bleach. Mr. Alvarez stepped out from behind the register and read the sign on the box twice. Community fund, immediate needs, bring your bill, no questions about status. And said, "I'll keep it by the lottery machine. That's where people come when math goes bad." Aiko nodded and affixed the tamper seal, so the opening had to be broken every time. Rosa filled out the location line on the reconciliation sheet, wrote the time, her initials, and felt the peculiar gravity of a job entering her life without ever having applied for it. The rules arrived as sentences half explained and complete. "No cash handoffs without a receipt," Aiko said, placing the first envelope into Rosa's hand as if teaching a grip. "Utilities, write the account and scan the bill with your phone for the file." She handed over a number for a shared drive and a passcode that would crumble if said out loud. "ID is preferred, not required. Names matter, faces matter more. No favor trades, no skipping the line, no borrowing from tomorrow on behalf of today without logging it. If anyone insists on being anonymous, log the initials and a context. A red scarf, a tattoo, something you'd remember in a week." Rosa took it all in with the quiet speed of someone who had been inventorying scarcity for years. The first client, if that was the word, was Mrs. Donnelly from the next block, bill in hand, and apology already attached to her breath. "My grandson's inhaler, same as Caleb's brand, and National Electric sent me a red notice," she said. Rosa took the bill, looked at the amount, wrote the voucher number on the receipt and said, "We'll pay National directly. Give me the account." She could feel Alvarez watching from the register, not with suspicion, but with that cautious hope people acquire when rules might finally bless them. At the laundromat, they placed another box between the coin changer and the faded no dies sign. The owner, 2 years into his beard and a lifetime into distrust, said, "I'll try it if it doesn't scare away business." Rosa replied, "It won't. It's here to keep you open." By the end of the second day, she knew which corners of the neighborhood drifted toward the boxes, like puzzle pieces trying to remember where they belonged. She learned the names she had only known as faces. Tasha, who worked nights at the call center, Joe with the bad knee, who blew leaves for the city when the season paid attention. Mr. Patel, with his pharmacy discounts, counted like rosary beads. She learned how to say no gently to a man who wanted to double-dip the grocery voucher, because the baby eats more when he hears the microwave. And yes, to a woman who had found herself the legal guardian of a sister's 2 boys after a court date that lasted 7 minutes. The ledger numbers became a story of their own. $120 out in groceries at Alvarez and Chavez, $85 to Metro Gas, 2 inhalers from Patel's at cost with his half smile, and "Tell Caleb I expect a drawing of a dragon in return." So when Rosa texted Aiko a photo of the tally, Aiko responded with a checkmark and "good. We'll replenish on Friday, report anomalies, don't try to solve the big machine." Kenji never appeared on site. Once his driver, a man with shoulders like a doorframe and a voice softer than felt, dropped a sealed envelope with utility checks already written and said, "Mr. Yakuza requests you prioritize shutoff notices. It calibrates goodwill." He called it a request. It sounded like a measurement. Rosa accepted the job that wasn't a job for reasons that fit inside the small space between her palm and Caleb's inhaler. Standing at the counter at Ruby's, after the first circuit of boxes, she counted her stipend into the blue notebook and thought of the rent notice that had learned to arrive without apologies. She told herself she could step out if something tripped a wire she couldn't name. In the same breath, she understood that stepping out wasn't a direction anyone offered to women like her. She took Caleb to Patel's that evening on the pretense of buying cough drops and paid for the new inhaler with the card she'd been given for emergency household purchase. Patel looked at the card, then at her, then chose to speak to the ledger, not the rumor. "I'll mark it wholesale," he said. "I like dragons." At home, she logged the expense, letter by letter, number by number, until the form was less a form and more a chord progression, something her hands could play without thinking. That night, she set the folder on the kitchen table like a guest who didn't know how long he would be staying, and as Caleb fell asleep with the nebulizer tube coiled like a tired snake on the cushion, she admitted to herself that need is not a virtue, but a fact. Kenji had addressed it like a fact. She could hate the man and still use the bridge he'd built to cross one more day. The routine wrote itself quickly. Ruby's at dawn, school drop-off for Caleb when his breathing agreed to cooperate, a sweep of Alvarez, Patel's, the laundromat, then the church office where the pastor signed with a flourish and said, "If you ever decide to lie for someone, don't do it here," which was his way of saying he would not ask for more than the ledger could give. Rosa developed a pocket patter that put people at ease, without promising what she couldn't deliver. "Bring me the bill and a name. We'll see what the box can carry." Sometimes she added, "If you can't write it down, I'll write it with you." And that turned receipts into confessions dressed as arithmetic. In whispers, people told her things the boxes weren't built to fix. A brother in county, a boss who shaved hours off the time card, a school counselor who insisted that quiet children were fine. Rosa listened, logged what fit, and tried not to inventory what didn't. And in the margins of each day, she marked the strange clarity of it all. Groceries appeared where there had been none. Electricity blinked on before a fridge turned warm. A pharmacist nodded and slid a bag across the counter without insisting on exact change. The help was real. It made dinners and small sleep possible. She could not show you its price on any of the receipts. It lived in the way Kenji Yakuza never needed to raise his voice, to own the distance between what people owed and what they could do about it. In the way her phone returned messages faster than truth used to travel. In the way the job had no contract she could tear up if the day soured. The help was real and the price invisible. The numbers stopped behaving first. Rosa noticed it at Alvarez Market when she totaled the day's ledger and her pencil hesitated at the last column. More money entering the boxes than leaving in vouchers, even after she counted the direct pay utility checks Kenji's driver had dropped off. She rechecked line items, $50 grocery, $35 copay for Mrs. Donnelly's inhaler, $120 Metrogas, then counted the cash tin twice. "You missed a slip," Mr. Alvarez offered from behind the counter, meaning to be kind. She shook her head and turned the reconciliation sheet toward him. "No, it balances on paper," she said, "just not in my head." At the laundromat, the box showed a similar diet. Thick mornings from anonymous donations, thinner afternoons after distributions, but never thin enough to match what she'd sent out across town. Aiko scanned Rosa's tally on the shared drive and sent back a one-sentence text. "Pattern holds across locations." When Rosa called, Aiko said quietly, "There are donors we never see, companies that prefer the box to the gala. They want outcomes, not their names on plaques." "Then why so much?" Rosa asked. Aiko hesitated. "Because scarcity is a brand everyone understands." The phrase landed wrong, like a dress she would never wear. Rosa rubbed her thumb over the corner of the ledger until it softened and told herself to watch, not decide. Kenji answered his phone on the second buzz and agreed to 10 minutes at the counter in the lull between lunch and the first after-school rush. He arrived in black as always, the kind of tailored that pretended not to be noticed, and waited for her to speak first. Rosa slid the latest sheets between the salt and the napkin dispenser. "We're getting more than we're giving," she said. "It's not wrong, but it is shaped." He studied the columns without touching them, as if her handwriting was part of the evidence. "Shaped," he echoed, offering no correction. "Who shapes it?" she pressed. "People with more money than time," he said, "and people with more enemies than they can afford. They prefer receipts to redemption. We oblige." She felt something in her unclench at the honesty and then clench again for the same reason. If they want to be clean, why not do it in public? He considered the question as if he'd expected a harder one. "Public is confession," he said. "This is a bridge." The words sat between them without dressing. "Philanthropy is a bridge, not a confession." She let the sentence show its bones, crossing, not kneeling, movement, not penance, and realized he'd told her everything she needed and nothing she could hold against him. After he left, she tested the phrase against the day's hard edges. At Patel's, where the pharmacy bell announced decisions instead of arrivals, she arranged for 2 asthma kits at cost, wrote voucher numbers on the carbon copies, and watched Patel make the math work because he liked Caleb's dragon drawings and because a community had to start somewhere. "You got more donors?" he asked casually, counting pills. "We got more mourning," she said, which was the truest shape of the truth she could speak. At the church office, the pastor tapped her ledger with a forefinger that had baptized babies and buried the young. "Accountability is love in public," he said, signing the reconciliation. She wanted to ask if secrecy could ever be love, but the line behind her had 3 shut-off notices and her phone vibrated with an alert from Aiko. "Metro Water approved, send confirmation." At Alvarez's, a teen with a backpack and eyes that measured exits slipped $10 into the slot and refused a receipt. "It's not a flex," he muttered. "Just my mother's light bill." Rosa logged M. Hoodie, left wrist scar, and wrote a note to herself to remember the backpack. The ledger tightened around her decisions like a belt. By midweek, the anomaly had a rhythm she could set her watch by. Before dawn, an envelope would appear in the back of Alvarez Market, tucked into the plastic bread racks with "For Rosa" in a hand that knew not to curve its letters. At the laundromat, Mrs. Kim pointed to the coin machine and said, "Somebody jammed this in," holding out a rubber-banded stack of 20s with a note, "For detergent and the first month back on track." At the church, the Sunday school teacher left a kid's crayon drawing of a blue box with a heart above it, and taped to the back a donation receipt made out by a shell company Rosa had seen once on a utility check, cleaner than air, weightless as intent. Rosa split the envelope amounts across sites, recorded intake lines with the precision of a claims adjuster, and still the inflow outran the outflow. She re-asked Aiko the question she had asked Kenji in a different accent. "What's the end game?" Aiko, whose loyalty was a quiet instrument Rosa had begun to trust, said, "Mine, relief that works. Theirs, optics that last longer than a headline. Yours," Rosa answered without thinking. "Breathing today." Aiko exhaled into the receiver, a sound that was not pity. "Then document like you expect to look yourself in the eye." So Rosa built a habit that felt like standing up straight. The blue notebook, once a catch-all for panic, became a calendar of consequence. She dated the deliveries with start times that matched the camera timestamps at Alvarez and the laundromat, so no one could claim a ghost had signed for anything. She taped Polaroids of the line on Tuesdays, faces half-turned, but present enough to refute any accusation that the boxes fed no one. She kept thank-you notes, a grandmother's cursive that looped into prayer, a child's block letters spelling milk, and copied every name that consented to be copied into a section called Witnesses. When Mr. Alvarez asked why she didn't just rely on the spreadsheets. She said, "Because paper talks to paper, and people talk to people, and I want them both on the same page." She added small details a spreadsheet would never request. The way Joe with the bad knee sat to count his change because standing hurt, the way Tasha checked her watch before taking a voucher because late was a fee, and fees were how the month bled. She wrote in the present tense on purpose, so later no one could say she remembered it prettier or uglier than it was. The more she recorded, the more she felt the ledger reach beyond arithmetic into something like testimony. At Patel's, she photographed the inhaler lot number next to the receipt and texted it to Aiko with "Delivered 3:17 p.m. And Patel witnessed, and Aiko replied with a dot and a check mark, the quiet language of accountability. Alvarez began taping his own small notes to the inside of the box lid. Mrs. S. came with grandson, electric paid. Mr. R. refused receipt, said some debts don't want paper, and Rosa copied them into her notebook so the box could not become a rumor. She labeled a page unanswered and wrote, "Where does the excess sleep? Who decides the morning wait? Who benefits from the whisper that the Yakuza fund works better than the city?" These questions did not accuse, they breathed. At night, when Caleb fell asleep with the nebulizer mask pushed up onto his forehead like a crooked crown, she placed the notebook beside the bed instead of on the kitchen table, the way some families keep a Bible within reach. She was not praying. She was building a spine out of sequence and signatures and the stubbornness of people who refused to vanish between lines. By week's end, when the boxes had changed more grocery lists than she could count, and the ledger still refused to behave by ordinary math, Rosa stopped asking the numbers to confess and started asking them to carry. She met Kenji for another brief conversation, standing this time by the back door where deliveries came in as facts and left as meals, and repeated his sentence to him so he could hear how it sounded in another mouth. "Philanthropy is a bridge," she said, "not a confession." He inclined his head, granting her the use of the line. "Bridges fall when they aren't maintained," he added, which was his way of telling her to keep writing. She went home and dated everything again. The time the van arrived, the minute Alvarez broke the seal after a crowd, the exact words Mrs. Donnelly used when she said the electric company had stopped calling. She pasted a photo of Caleb drawing a dragon for Patel, not because it proved anything in court, but because it proved something to her about what survival looked like when it didn't have to apologize. And when she read the pages back to herself, present tense, specific, unadorned, she felt the weight redistribute from rumor to record. In the act of registering, she discovered the second truth, that the truth itself gained weight when it breathed in the present. The numbers stopped behaving first. Rosa noticed it at Alvarez Market when she totaled the day's ledger and her pencil hesitated at the last column. More money entering the boxes than leaving in vouchers, even after she counted the direct pay utility checks Kenji's driver had dropped off. She rechecked line items, $50 grocery, $35 copay for Mrs. Donnelly's inhaler, $120 Metrogas, then counted the cash tin twice. "You missed a slip," Mr. Alvarez offered from behind the counter, meaning to be kind. She shook her head and turned the reconciliation sheet toward him. "No, it balances on paper," she said, "just not in my head." At the laundromat, the box showed a similar diet. Thick mornings from anonymous donations, thinner afternoons after distributions, but never thin enough to match what she'd sent out across town. Aiko scanned Rosa's tally on the shared drive and sent back a one-sentence text. "Pattern holds across locations." When Rosa called, Aiko said quietly, "There are donors we never see, companies that prefer the box to the gala. They want outcomes, not their names on plaques." "Then why so much?" Rosa asked. Aiko hesitated. "Because scarcity is a brand everyone understands." The phrase landed wrong, like a dress she would never wear. Rosa rubbed her thumb over the corner of the ledger until it softened and told herself to watch, not decide. Kenji answered his phone on the second buzz and agreed to 10 minutes at the counter in the lull between lunch and the first after-school rush. He arrived in black as always, the kind of tailored that pretended not to be noticed, and waited for her to speak first. Rosa slid the latest sheets between the salt and the napkin dispenser. "We're getting more than we're giving," she said. "It's not wrong, but it is shaped." He studied the columns without touching them, as if her handwriting was part of the evidence. "Shaped," he echoed, offering no correction. "Who shapes it?" she pressed. "People with more money than time," he said, "and people with more enemies than they can afford. They prefer receipts to redemption. We oblige." She felt something in her unclench at the honesty and then clench again for the same reason. If they want to be clean, why not do it in public? He considered the question as if he'd expected a harder one. "Public is confession," he said. "This is a bridge." The words sat between them without dressing. "Philanthropy is a bridge, not a confession." She let the sentence show its bones, crossing, not kneeling, movement, not penance, and realized he'd told her everything she needed and nothing she could hold against him. After he left, she tested the phrase against the day's hard edges. At Patel's, where the pharmacy bell announced decisions instead of arrivals, she arranged for 2 asthma kits at cost, wrote voucher numbers on the carbon copies, and watched Patel make the math work because he liked Caleb's dragon drawings and because a community had to start somewhere. "You got more donors?" he asked casually, counting pills. "We got more mourning," she said, which was the truest shape of the truth she could speak. At the church office, the pastor tapped her ledger with a forefinger that had baptized babies and buried the young. "Accountability is love in public," he said, signing the reconciliation. She wanted to ask if secrecy could ever be love, but the line behind her had 3 shut-off notices and her phone vibrated with an alert from Aiko. "Metro Water approved, send confirmation." At Alvarez's, a teen with a backpack and eyes that measured exits slipped $10 into the slot and refused a receipt. "It's not a flex," he muttered. "Just my mother's light bill." Rosa logged M. Hoodie, left wrist scar, and wrote a note to herself to remember the backpack. The ledger tightened around her decisions like a belt. By midweek, the anomaly had a rhythm she could set her watch by. Before dawn, an envelope would appear in the back of Alvarez Market, tucked into the plastic bread racks with "For Rosa" in a hand that knew not to curve its letters. At the laundromat, Mrs. Kim pointed to the coin machine and said, "Somebody jammed this in," holding out a rubber-banded stack of 20s with a note, "For detergent and the first month back on track." At the church, the Sunday school teacher left a kid's crayon drawing of a blue box with a heart above it, and taped to the back a donation receipt made out by a shell company Rosa had seen once on a utility check. Cleaner than air, weightless as intent. Rosa split the envelope amounts across sites, recorded intake lines with the precision of a claims adjuster, and still the inflow outran the outflow. She re-asked Aiko the question she had asked Kenji in a different accent. "What's the end game?" Aiko, whose loyalty was a quiet instrument Rosa had begun to trust, said, "Mine, relief that works. Theirs, optics that last longer than a headline. Yours," Rosa answered without thinking. "Breathing today." Aiko exhaled into the receiver, a sound that was not pity. "Then document like you expect to look yourself in the eye." So Rosa built a habit that felt like standing up straight. The blue notebook, once a catch-all for panic, became a calendar of consequence. She dated the deliveries with start times that matched the camera timestamps at Alvarez and the laundromat, so no one could claim a ghost had signed for anything. She taped Polaroids of the line on Tuesdays, faces half-turned, but present enough to refute any accusation that the boxes fed no one. She kept thank you notes, a grandmother's cursive that looped into prayer, a child's block letters spelling milk and copied every name that consented to be copied into a section called witnesses. When Mr. Alvarez asked why she didn't just rely on the spreadsheets, she said, "Because paper talks to paper and people talk to people, and I want them both on the same page." She added small details a spreadsheet would never request. The way Joe with the bad knee sat to count his change because standing hurt, the way Tasha checked her watch before taking a voucher because late was a fee, and fees were how the month bled. She wrote in the present tense on purpose, so later no one could say she remembered it prettier or uglier than it was. The more she recorded, the more she felt the ledger reach beyond arithmetic into something like testimony. At Patel's, she photographed the inhaler lot number next to the receipt and texted it to Aiko with "Delivered 3:17 p.m. Patel witnessed, and Aiko replied with a dot and a check mark, the quiet language of accountability. Alvarez began taping his own small notes to the inside of the box lid. Mrs. S. came with grandson, electric paid. Mr. R. refused receipt, said some debts don't want paper, and Rosa copied them into her notebook so the box could not become a rumor. She labeled a page unanswered and wrote, "Where does the excess sleep? Who decides the morning wait? Who benefits from the whisper that the Yakuza fund works better than the city?" These questions did not accuse, they breathed. At night, when Caleb fell asleep with the nebulizer mask pushed up onto his forehead like a crooked crown, she placed the notebook beside the bed instead of on the kitchen table, the way some families keep a Bible within reach. She was not praying. She was building a spine out of sequence and signatures and the stubbornness of people who refused to vanish between lines. By week's end, when the boxes had changed more grocery lists than she could count, and the ledger still refused to behave by ordinary math, Rosa stopped asking the numbers to confess and started asking them to carry. She met Kenji for another brief conversation, standing this time by the back door where deliveries came in as facts and left as meals, and repeated his sentence to him so he could hear how it sounded in another mouth. "Philanthropy is a bridge," she said, "not a confession." He inclined his head, granting her the use of the line. "Bridges fall when they aren't maintained," he added, which was his way of telling her to keep writing. She went home and dated everything again. The time the van arrived, the minute Alvarez broke the seal after a crowd, the exact words Mrs. Donnelly used when she said the electric company had stopped calling. She pasted a photo of Caleb drawing a dragon for Patel, not because it proved anything in court, but because it proved something to her about what survival looked like when it didn't have to apologize. And when she read the pages back to herself, present tense, specific, unadorned, she felt the weight redistribute from rumor to record. In the act of registering, she discovered the second truth, that the truth itself gained weight when it breathed in the present. Maya Collins called between the lunch checks and the first after-school rush, her voice so steady it felt like someone holding a door instead of knocking on it. "Ms. Jenkins, my name is Maya. I'm working on a piece about community funds." "I know about North River's front," she said, not breathless, not triumphant, just sure. Rosa pinched the phone between her shoulder and cheek while she counted vouchers into the ledger, letting the silence do the work that words would only complicate. "You have the wrong person," she said finally. "I pour coffee. I don't pour the truth on television." Maya didn't argue. She made room. "Then let me be wrong on the record. 5 minutes, off camera, off the books. You can tell me no twice if you need to." Rosa pictured the black suit on the curb that morning weeks ago, the clean fold of a folder closing, the way a life can be moved with a sentence. "I can't help you," she said, and hung up before the echo could make it sound less decided. When the phone buzzed again with a voicemail, she let it stack without listening. She wrote down Alvarez, 3 vouchers, 1 utility in the blue notebook, and told herself there were different kinds of courage. This one looked like refusing to be useful to someone else's headline. The notes began as polite fingerprints on her day. A folded square slid under the back door of Ruby's. For Rosa, sources on Delancey Capital. More dots than people realize. A business card tucked into the seam of the diner's napkin holder with 5 words in block letters. I know about North River's front, underlined twice. Rosa set each item beside the coffee maker as if heat could bleach its intent. She mentioned it to Mr. Alvarez while replacing the tamper seal on the box. Reporters want to put a frame around a fire, he said not unkindly. Frames don't stop burns. At the laundromat, Mrs. Kim, who had a cousin who once worked at WBRH, lifted her eyebrows and asked, "She's the calm one. Careful with calm ones." "They don't back away when a door closes," Rosa replied with a practiced shrug. "I have a boy to keep breathing. That's the story I can carry." She texted Aiko, "Reporter sniffing, left notes, I'm declining." Aiko responded almost immediately. Noted, log any contact. Don't engage specifics. If pressed, say boxes are for bills, not for talk. The line read like policy and mercy at once. Maya did not stop. She waited outside Alvarez Market with a grocery bag in hand, like a neighbor killing time. When Rosa wheeled the box cart across the tiled floor, Maya stepped forward, palms up, letting Rosa choose the distance. "I brought rice and milk for Mrs. Donnelly," she said. "You can tell me to leave after I set them down." Rosa didn't touch the bag. "We're not bartering with groceries," she said. "People bring what they bring. The ledger brings what it brings." Maya nodded as if to say, "We speak the same language," then tried a different grammar. "No names," she offered. "Just process. You say I saw and I say a clerk said. Nothing you say gets your son pulled into a shot." She didn't reach for the notebook. She didn't ask to see the ledger. She only looked at Rosa's face, and almost as an aside, the small crease she'd learned to watch near the mouth of women who carried 2 jobs and the wrong kind of attention. "I can't," Rosa said, keeping her tone flat so her fear wouldn't find a foothold. "You think fear is your reason?" "I think it's your map," Maya said, then let it rest. "If you ever decide to speak, I'll make sure the sentence doesn't turn into a weapon before it lands." "That's not a promise you can keep," Rosa said. "You'd be surprised," Maya replied, as if the surprise was where the work started. By the end of the week, the messages narrowed from invitations to evidences. A printed flowchart arrived in the diner's mail slot. North River, Delancey Capital, El Camino Holdings. Each arrow annotated with crossover directors and a P.O. box that appeared in 3 separate filings. On the back, in Maya's neat hand, different names, same owners. Rosa stared at the arrows long enough to feel them in her teeth. She folded the page once, then again, and slid it deep into the blue notebook under unanswered, next to her own questions about morning envelopes and unclaimed donors. Caleb wandered into the kitchen balancing a cereal bowl, a curl of milk ribboning down the side. "We learning anything good?" he asked, because to him paper meant homework, even when it had nothing to do with school. "Just that grown-ups like drawing lines," she said, tapping the triangles Maya had drawn around the shell companies. "You do lines too," he said, pointing to the ledger. "Mine feed people," she said, immediately wishing she hadn't made it sound like an argument. She kissed his forehead and told him to pack his inhaler anyway. Later, alone at the counter, she typed to Aiko, "She's not guessing, she has filings." Aiko replied, "Of course she does. Good reporters do. Stay with our lane. Document, distribute. Don't carry what isn't yours." Rosa stared at that last sentence until it fell apart. Everything she carried had once not been hers. That evening's sweep of the boxes should have been routine, but routine had begun to feel like something borrowed. At Alvarez, a teenager with a scrape on his knuckles dropped 2 crumpled 5s into the slot and shook his head when Rosa offered a receipt. "For my mother's light," he mumbled. Rosa wrote M. Hoodie, scrape, refused receipt in the corner of her sheet and thanked him like a peer. At the laundromat, a woman with a bleach-stained sweater lifted a shut-off notice as if it might bite and asked, "Do you call them, or do I?" "We call," Rosa said. "We pay direct. You keep the receipt." The woman cried without noise and folded the notice into corners, sharp as decision. On the way to the church office, Rosa's phone buzzed with another voicemail from Maya. She didn't listen, but she read the transcription. "I will not put your son on TV. I don't even need your voice. I need your sequence." Rosa deleted the message and immediately dredged it back from the trash, a reflex that annoyed her for being honest. At the church, the pastor signed with his usual flourish and added, "If the city ever asks, this book makes a better sermon than anything I've got." "I hope they don't ask," Rosa said. "They will," he answered, not as threat, but as weather. When Rosa turned the key in her front door just after dark, she already felt the shape of a knight that wanted to teach her something she wasn't ready to learn. She put the tote on the table, checked the kitchen counter for the folder, and walked down the hall to Caleb's room to tell him she'd brought the cereal he liked for tomorrow. The window latch was standing straight up, not flat, and the screen, which always stuck at the bottom, no longer complained from its frame. Caleb slept curled on his side, hoodie bunched at his shoulder, the inhaler resting in the hollow made by his hands, as if someone had placed it there and decided to leave the rest of him untouched. Rosa didn't scream. She counted. 1. Caleb breathing, steady. 2. Inhaler within reach. 3. Backpack under the chair. 4. The blue notebook safe on the kitchen table where she'd left it. Nothing missing. Everything altered. She pressed the window down until the latch clicked and stood for a long minute with her palm flat against the cool metal, bargaining with no one. In the room's hum, she understood more sharply than any conversation could have taught her that she was on a bridge without a guardrail. Every step carried a view she hadn't asked for and a fall she could not survive. And in that understanding came the last, smaller, crueler truth, that silence wasn't neutral ground, it was momentum. It tilted her the same direction as a push. She sat on the edge of the bed, watched her son's chest rise and fall, and admitted for the first time that not speaking was just another way of letting go. Rosa sat at her small kitchen table with the blue spiral notebook open like a wound she was finally willing to clean. Each page had become more than ink. It was evidence, memory, quiet protest. She wasn't trying to bring anyone down. She wasn't even sure what justice would look like in a world where people like Kenji walked into lives like hers and turned everything upside down with a single piece of paper. But she knew what patterns looked like. She could trace the curve of a lie as easily as she traced Caleb's breathing through the night. She started listing routes, when the black vans came, what time they left, who they spoke to before parking in front of donation sites. She wrote down amounts of envelopes, cross-referenced with names she'd seen in line more than once. No one told her to do this. No one gave her a reason. But deep down, Rosa knew something. If she didn't document it, it would disappear. Not just the help. The fear, the compromise, the trembling sense that her small life had been turned into someone else's chessboard. And Rosa, for once, refused to be a pawn without a log of every move. Attached to each list were copies, photocopied eviction notices, utility statements with red stamps, delivery slips from food boxes left at doorsteps at midnight. She collected thank you notes from grandmothers who wrote as if they were speaking to God. She kept receipts, yes, but also fragments of voice, like the man who told her he hadn't eaten meat in 3 months until the funds box arrived with chicken thighs and canned beans. She began taking photos on her old phone, printing them at the drugstore 2 towns over, careful not to tag any names. Rosa wasn't building a case, not exactly. She was building memory, a memory that wouldn't be erased when the tide turned, or Kenji vanished again into whatever silent empire he operated from. Rosa didn't think in terms of revenge. She thought in terms of proof. Her whole life had been made unbelievable by systems too big to argue with. But this notebook, could not be ignored. Not if something went wrong. Not if someone got hurt. Not if, one day, she had to tell her son why she played along with something that never looked quite right, but kept his lungs full. When Maya arrived at Ruby's, it wasn't with a camera or crew, just a battered leather satchel and eyes that had clearly read more than she'd published. The diner was almost empty, but Rosa still asked the manager for the booth with the blinds halfway shut. It felt right. She slid into the seat without a smile, placing the notebook between them as if it were sacred or dangerous or both. Maya didn't touch it. She simply asked, "Are you ready to speak in the present tense?" Rosa exhaled. "That's the only way I can speak anymore," she said. "Past tense gets edited. Present tense breathes." And so she told it all, not as a tale of crime or conspiracy, but as a map of days. The calls the bank never returned, the men who loaded boxes with military precision, the tattered gratitude in people's eyes when they saw her coming down the block with a clipboard and hope. She didn't name Kenji. She didn't have to. Maya didn't push. She listened like someone who knew how to sit inside another person's silence without turning it into a headline. She asked only what needed asking. Rosa answered what she could carry without shaking. When Rosa paused, Maya finally reached for the notebook, not to take it, but to weigh it. Her fingertips brushed the edge, as if measuring the weight of courage per page. "This isn't just record-keeping," she murmured. "This is spine. This is a body of truth." Rosa didn't reply, but her jaw set. That was all Maya needed. She pulled a small envelope from her satchel and slid it across the table. "Insurance," she said. "If anything happens to me, or you, or this place, this goes to the State Attorney General and 3 newsrooms that hate each other enough not to collude." Rosa didn't ask what was inside. She nodded, tucked it in her bag without a glance, and returned her gaze to the notebook. She wasn't naive. She knew what Maya was risking. But Maya hadn't come to make Rosa brave. She'd come because Rosa already was. And bravery didn't always look like defiance. Sometimes it looked like receipts. Sometimes it looked like standing still when someone powerful told you to sit down. They stayed a while in that booth, neither rushing. The waitress came and went. Rosa didn't touch her coffee. Maya scribbled something on a napkin. Just a phrase. Rosa couldn't see it, but left it face down. Before she left, she looked Rosa in the eye and said, "You don't owe me anything. But the truth deserves a witness." Rosa wanted to say something back, something final, but no words felt right. So she just nodded slowly and watched Maya leave, coat flapping behind her like a flag in retreat. She stared at the notebook again. It had started as a way to contain panic. Now it held decisions, trajectories, every quiet compromise she had made under the weight of survival, and maybe, just maybe, a path out. Not clean, not heroic, but honest. And Rosa could live with that. She had to. By the time the diner cleared out, Rosa was the only one left. She asked the manager for a plastic bag and sealed the notebook inside, then held it for a long while on her lap, like she was afraid it would burn or vanish. She looked out the window, saw nothing unusual, and then stood. When she left Ruby's that night, she didn't look over her shoulder. She didn't have to. The fear would follow, but so would the truth. The chapter she had begun in silence had now been spoken out loud, and that changed everything. The blue notebook was no longer just protection, it was her backbone, a living record of a world that had tried to bury her and the people like her, but now, through her handwriting and stubborn clarity, would have to answer to itself. When the segment finally aired, Rosa watched it with her arms crossed and her breath barely steady. Maya had kept her word. No names were spoken, and no accusations were spelled out in block letters. The word Yakuza never once appeared, but the screen didn't need to say it. The images did enough damage on their own. There it was, The moment of the halted eviction, frozen on the television screen. Caleb wrapped in a hoodie, Rosa mid-step, and Kenji Yakuza. Calm, composed, delivering folded papers to the sheriff with the quiet dominance of someone who didn't need to explain himself. Intercut were shots of the blue boxes scattered across the city, lined up in front of supermarkets, corner stores, schools. Some were filled with bags of groceries, others already emptied by hands that didn't care where help came from. Voiceovers narrated community uplift and shifting ownership patterns, and even though the narration danced delicately, it was clear to anyone watching that something massive and invisible had moved into the neighborhood, and was now being named, if not directly, then unmistakably. Rosa knew the cost of that kind of naming. You didn't have to say fire for someone to strike the match. She didn't sleep the night it aired. Instead, she sat by Caleb's bedside, watching the slow rise and fall of his chest. She wanted to believe things were better. The truth, spoken clearly, could be enough. But Rosa had lived long enough to know that exposure didn't always bring justice. Sometimes it brought retaliation. She checked every lock twice, her fingers trembling more with each turn. The next day passed in a strange hush. A few customers at the diner looked at her differently, some curious, some wary, one older man offering a gentle nod that said he'd seen the report and understood more than he let on. But Kenji didn't come in. That's what unsettled her most. She hadn't expected confrontation, but his silence felt deliberate, almost surgical, the way you wait to see how deep a cut goes before you apply pressure. Then, 2 nights later, Rosa stepped out back to toss a garbage bag and froze. Sitting on the ground by the diner's back door was a single matte black box. Square, lid shut tight, no logos, no tape, no note. Her first instinct was panic. She didn't call anyone. She just stood there, muscles tight, staring at it like it might detonate. After a full minute, she crouched down slowly and opened the lid. Inside was Caleb's inhaler. Not a replacement, his inhaler. The exact one he kept by the couch, with the scratch along the side from when it fell weeks ago. He never left home without it, and she'd seen it on the kitchen table just the night before. Rosa rushed back inside, heart pounding, and ran to Caleb's room. He was sleeping, undisturbed, the blanket tucked to his chin. She checked his breath, then his hands, then the drawer where the spare inhaler should have been. Everything was in place, but the message was clear. Someone had been in their home, had walked in without a trace, touched what mattered, and left a silent reminder that safety was always borrowed. Rosa sat down hard on the floor, gripping the black box like it could still bite. There was no note. None was needed. The absence of threat was the threat. She understood now, without ambiguity. This wasn't a partnership, it had never been. The phone rang later that night. She answered before the second ring, already knowing who it was. Kenji didn't bother with greetings. His voice was flat, unhurried, like someone reading the terms of a contract already signed. "Truth without context," he said, "is a weapon." Rosa didn't reply. Her throat felt like sandpaper. Kenji continued, "You may think you told your story, but stories told in fragments become knives. You hand them to people who don't care about what came before or what comes after. You handed them one." His tone wasn't angry. It was colder than that, the practiced dispassion of someone used to delivering consequences. Rosa's hand tightened around the receiver. "You made your point," she said low. "I didn't name you. I didn't have to." There was a pause, almost imperceptible. "Then silence isn't neutral," Kenji replied. "Remember that." And the line went dead. No threat, no closure. Just the echo of a man who had offered her protection and now warned her how quickly it could be revoked. She didn't tell Caleb what had happened. She couldn't. Not yet. The boy had enough ghosts breathing down his neck. Instead, Rosa spent the next morning packing a small go bag, just in case. She stashed some cash, the spare inhaler, copies of the blue notebook pages she considered most important. She memorized 3 routes out of town and looked at motel prices in cities far enough that the funds boxes didn't reach. But she didn't leave. Not yet. Because the other line of thought, the braver, more reckless one, told her that running now would be finishing someone else's story. And Rosa Jenkins, waitress, mother, survivor of foreclosure notices and invisible wars, was beginning to understand that sometimes survival wasn't about escape. It was about standing still while everything tried to move you. She taped the black box shut and placed it at the back of a kitchen cabinet behind expired spices and forgotten mugs. A reminder, not of fear, but of what happens when you forget who owns the silence around you. And so, when night came again, Rosa returned to the diner. Same booth, same apron. She poured coffee for men who didn't know her name and counted tips by instinct. But inside, everything had changed. The bridge she walked, the one she had once thought was built of gratitude and necessity, was creaking now under the weight of truth, loyalty, and fear. Maya had done her job. Rosa had done hers. And Kenji, in his own way, had made sure she understood the rules hadn't changed just because someone whispered the truth on television. The air wasn't cleaner. It was just heavier. When she closed up that night, Caleb was already asleep on the break room couch, as always. Rosa kissed his forehead and locked the back door behind her with deliberate care. One more box had entered her life, darker than the others, silent as consequence. And even though her son was safe, Rosa knew the message hadn't come for Caleb. It had come for her. And she had heard it loud and clear. The first sign came quietly. The blue boxes began to vanish, one by one. Rosa noticed it on a Tuesday. She passed by the laundromat on her way to drop off receipts and saw the pedestal where the donation box had been. Empty. A few days later, the same had happened in front of Martin's grocery. No replacement, no warning, just absence. The following morning, she opened the register at Ruby's and found only one envelope left, already earmarked for the Sandoval family, whose baby needed formula and asthma meds. She called the number Kenji had given her months ago, the one printed on the card he'd slid across the diner counter when this all started. No answer. She tried again after lunch. Nothing. Then again, right before closing. Voicemail. Just a quiet beep. No greeting. And then news hit the radio. North River Bank had shuttered 2 branches pending an internal audit. Rosa didn't need a financial expert to explain what that meant. Whatever web had held this system together was unraveling fast, and Kenji Yakuza, the man who had once commanded sheriffs and silenced threats with a nod, had disappeared into his own shadow. Despite everything, the silence, the vanishing support, the weight of uncertainty, the line still formed the next morning. Before sunrise, Rosa stepped out to unlock the diner's door and found them waiting. Mothers with toddlers in their arms, elderly men leaning on canes or worn shopping carts, teenagers pretending not to watch her with hope in their eyes. Rosa recognized most of them, not their last names or birthdays, just the way their voices cracked when asking for formula, or the way they cradled grocery lists like confessions. She didn't hesitate. She opened the door. There was no grand announcement, no instructions. She walked to the back, took out the envelopes, only a few remained, and began handing them out, one by one. Each time she pressed one into a palm, she said the person's name, looked them in the eye. She didn't try to apologize or explain. This wasn't charity anymore. It was continuity, ritual, proof that they were still seen even if no one else was watching. Each person left with less than they'd hoped for, but more than they'd had. Rosa didn't turn anyone away. When she ran out of envelopes, she walked back to the counter, opened the coin jar near the register, the one with the duct-taped lid labeled Caleb's Camp Fund, and broke it open. She counted the coins carefully, filled 3 small paper bags with exact change, and gave those out too. It wasn't enough. It was never enough, but not one person left empty-handed. That mattered, more than she'd expected. A woman named Joanne, who'd been coming every Friday for 2 months, gripped Rosa's hand and whispered, "We came because you stayed." Rosa blinked hard, nodded, but didn't trust herself to speak. Behind her, the coffee burned. Orders were missed. It didn't matter. The diner had become something else entirely, a station for those trying to hang on one more day. Caleb watched from the break room doorway, silent but alert, his blanket around his shoulders, and his eyes fixed on the line that never seemed to end. The last person in line was an older man Rosa didn't recognize. His face was leathery with age and sun, and he held a folded electric bill in one hand like a passport. "This is all I've got," he said, voice rasped. "And I know it ain't your fault if it's not enough." Rosa met his gaze, reached into her own wallet, and pulled out $20, her own. She hadn't even checked what tips she'd made the day before. She handed it to him. "Come back tomorrow," she said. "I can't promise more, but I'll be here." He nodded once, tucked the bill away, and walked off without a word. When the line was finally gone, Rosa leaned on the counter, exhausted, hands trembling. The drawer where the envelopes used to be was empty, bone dry, but somehow she felt more full than she had in days. Caleb came out and stood beside her. "Are we gonna be okay?" he asked quietly. Rosa ran her hand through his hair, gently. "I don't know yet," she answered, "but we'll show up again. That's how it starts." She didn't close the diner early that day. She kept it running like it was just another Thursday. Customers trickled in, some regulars, some strangers. None of them asked about the line, and Rosa didn't explain. Explaining felt like using words for something only action could describe. At night, after cleaning up and setting aside the last slice of meatloaf for Caleb, she sat down with the blue notebook. She didn't write anything new. She just turned the pages. Records of days where there'd been more envelopes, more boxes, more security. She thought about Kenji, about what it meant that he'd vanished without even a warning, and yet, in his absence, people still came. That told her something. Maybe not about him, but about herself. Her reach, her presence, that it could mean something without power behind it. Maybe presence, when consistent, became a kind of currency in its own right, not one that bought silence or control, but one that paid for hope, one person at a time. So when Rosa locked up that night, the air felt different, not safer, not lighter, but settled, a little more hers. There were no guarantees. Kenji might return, the donations might stop entirely, the whispers might grow teeth. But for now, the promise she'd made to every face in that line still held. She would be back tomorrow. Not with cash, not with power, just herself. And somehow, that mattered. She turned off the lights, stepped outside, and let the door click shut behind her. It wasn't the sound of an ending. It was a pause, the breath between one promise kept and the next, waiting to be made. That night, there were no headlines waiting, no reporters circling the diner, no threats in the form of envelopes or quiet knocks at the back door. It was just Rosa, finally off her feet, sitting on the threadbare couch next to Caleb. His breathing had steadied into soft, even pulls of air through the plastic mouthpiece of his inhaler, which rose and fell on his chest like a slow tide. Rosa didn't reach for the television or the phone. She reached for the blue notebook that had grown heavier in her hands over the months, not because of its weight, but because of what it now carried. She flipped past dates and figures, scanned through copied receipts, the names of families who once stood in her line and for one quiet moment no longer had to. Then turning to the final page, she uncapped her pen and wrote the only sentence that felt true enough to end with, "We were here, and we told the truth." Her handwriting shook at first, but the ink flowed firm. There were no fireworks to mark this moment, no message from Kenji Yakuza, no closure wrapped in ceremony. Only her son's steady breath, the sound of survival, uninterrupted. She looked down at Caleb and tucked the blanket a little higher around his shoulders. His face had softened in sleep, the lines of worry in his brow finally eased. How many nights had she laid awake, wondering if they'd make it to this point? How many times had she clutched that notebook like a lifeline, scribbling notes and names, because that was the only language she had left to speak the truth? Kenji had walked into her life like a storm wrapped in tailored silence, undone a bank's grip with a gesture, and then vanished just as easily. He had never made promises, not in words. And still, the impact of his presence and his disappearance had rearranged the foundation of everything. Yet here they were, not untouched but unbroken. She watched Caleb's chest rise again, rhythmic, quiet, certain. Whatever came next, this moment was theirs, and that, she thought, had to count for something. No cars pulled into the driveway, no figures stood across the street watching. No boxes arrived, not from the Yakuza Foundation, not from ghost donors or hidden ledgers. And still, Rosa didn't feel abandoned. Maybe because she no longer needed permission to act. Maybe because the community had begun to see her not as an extension of a power she didn't understand, but as a constant they could trust. Power disappears. Presence lingers. The line had kept showing up because she had, not because she wore a suit or signed checks, but because she never stopped opening the door. That kind of trust, she was learning, doesn't dissolve with budgets or exit strategies. It sticks, person to person, name to name. It outlives the noise. And though the notebook felt like the last chapter of something, the stillness in the room didn't feel like an ending. It felt like space, a space wide enough for a new sentence, if not yet a new story. When Rosa finally stood, she carried the blue notebook with her to the kitchen and tucked it in the drawer beneath the towels. Not hidden, not on display, just there, accessible, real, something she could pull out again if ever questioned, if ever needed. It was strange, she thought, how something so small had become the spine of her decisions, numbers scribbled on paper, observations about trucks, donations, names. It had helped her speak when speaking felt dangerous, had helped her see when the world tried to obscure. She didn't know if it was evidence or memory, or simply proof that she hadn't imagined the weight of what she'd lived through. But it was hers. It didn't belong to Kenji, or the bank, or any journalist hoping for a scoop. It was just Rosa's account of what happened. That was enough. That was what remained. And then morning came. The sun rose like it always did, and Ruby's diner opened its door as it always had. Except when Rosa stepped outside, the first thing she noticed wasn't the silence. It was the box. It sat right outside the front step, not blue, not branded, not locked. Just a plain cardboard box with a handwritten sign taped to the top. Neighborhood Fund, register with Rosa. Inside were envelopes, real bills, coins, handwritten slips from neighbors, the ones who had once received, now giving back. No Kenji, no hidden agenda. Just names, real ones and amounts they could spare. It wasn't absolution. It didn't erase what had come before. But it was something different, not control, not charity, community. It didn't need to be bigger than that. It only needed to be now. As Rosa stood over the box, hand resting gently on its lid, a thought passed through her, quiet but undeniable. Empires tremble louder than houses. They're built to. They're noisy, impossible to ignore, and always falling in ways that make headlines. But houses, especially the kind built on promises made at diner counters and the echo of breath in a child's lungs, can stay standing long after the dust settles. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She just picked up the box, walked back into the diner, and placed it behind the counter. The neighborhood had decided. She had been chosen again, not by power, not by fear, but by people who believed she would show up tomorrow. And she would. We pour heart and time into every story we share here, not just to entertain, but to connect with you. When you subscribe to our channel, you're helping us bring more meaningful stories to life. Stories that reflect the strength, resilience, and depth of people just like you. If this one moved you in any way, leave us a comment below. We truly want to hear what it made you feel or think. Every like, every comment, and every new subscriber helps keep this community alive and growing. Thank you for being here with us. We'll be waiting for you in the next chapter.